This is Radio Free Cobalt.
Sun starts to shine.
The Paymaster disaster.
3 rings of the bell. Beneath the bottom.
You didn't miss cage call. Miss the cage? You might as well stay home. Miss the cage a couple times, and you'd better find another line of work. In the Paymaster number 5 shaft, the graveyard crew stopped hauling muck around 5:30 in the morning. Cage call for the morning shift started at 7:30 and ran till just after 8. When the cage bell sounded, every miner was expected to have their gear on, their lamps ready, and their day's instruction from the ship boss. That's how they moved the 140 miners to the various mining levels that were spread out like the stories of an underground building. Every miner knew when to meet the cage at the start of the shift and when to be waiting at the end of the shift. Eddie Taillefer and Larry Bilodeau were regulars on the 3rd cage. It usually left surface just before 8. On Friday, February 2nd, 1945, Larry and Eddie unexpectedly decided to jump in with the boys on cage number 2. There was a lot of good-natured shoving and calls of, "Hey, come on, get on the next one." And then just to rub it in, Larry called out to Paul Stringer, another regular on the 3rd cage. "Come on, Paul, there's lots of room in here." So Paul jumped aboard, the miners groaned, and made room for one more. Cage operators, Nicky Supa and Stanley Kolajewski, seeing that the men were safely aboard, closed the rusted cage door and rang the buzzer to give the all clear. And the cage then plunged into the wet darkness at 1,200 feet a minute. Meanwhile, on the main deck, Mike Parnetta and Melvin Markosik were anxiously looking around to see if their buddy Stan Pillik had shown up yet. The 3 were Ukrainian boys from Saskatchewan, and they'd just been hired at the Paymaster 3 weeks before, along with Mike's cousin, Joe. Now, Joe had been caught sleeping on the job yesterday and had been handed a 2-day suspension. And if Stan didn't get here soon, he'd be getting a suspension as well. Coming up beside them was somebody who should have missed this shift. Marvin Appleyard was coughing hard from a bad chest cold. He'd planned to take the day off to recuperate, but changed his mind at the last minute. As the clock ticked toward 8, the cage reappeared at the surface. The cage door swung open, the protective gate was pushed up. Nicky Supa stepped out on the deck and started shouting for the boys to start hauling their asses. Mike Mohorak jumped aboard along with Ubal Legault, Alphonse Auger, and Alfred Plourde. Russell Mickey Dillon was next. All in all, things turned out pretty good for Mickey. He'd been an air gunner in the night war over Germany. Not many gunners made it through the mandatory 50 missions, but Mickey's burst eardrum had earned him a ticket home, so now he was back, a war hero, an Allen Cup hockey star, and holding a safe job down on the sample gang. 19-year-old Eno Naimi was the second sampler on the morning shift. It was his first week underground, and going down in the cage was still an adventure. It must have been a very different sort of adventure for his mother. She lost her husband John in the Paymaster mine just 12 days before young Eno was born. Eno's dad had been riding in the cage in this very shaft when the cable broke, and he fell to his death. But what were the chances of lightning striking in the same spot twice? Young Eno Niemi jostled in space in the dark rusted cage along with 2 other Finlanders, T. Vuottalainen and Eero Kotila, who had just come back to work after a 6-month leave of absence. Hector Poitoire was already on the cage when someone pointed out to him he wasn't wearing his light, and the boys all laughed as Hector had to rush back to the lamp room. He'd catch the next cage. A. Balland, a father of 11 children, took his place, along with Liguri Lauzon, who was starting his first shift without his partner and brother-in-law Hector Beauchamp. Hector had just decided the day before to switch shifts with another crew. Then the father and son team of George and Larry Dubo stepped on board. "Hey, there's no more room," someone shouted from the back, and so Father George stepped off onto the deck. "You take this cage," he said to his 19-year-old son. "I'll grab the next one." And with that, the door shut, and the cage began its 3rd descent of the morning.
We are soldiers in the war down below.
They had just passed the 900-foot level, however, when the hoist cable snapped, and the cage began free-falling into the darkness. Immediately, the emergency dogs, the brakes on the side of the cage elevator, sprang up and tried to lock onto the timber lining of the shaft. And for a few seconds, the descent slowed, but the dogs quickly gummed up with shredded wet wood, and as the cage began to pick up speed, the dogs clawed and shredded their way down the timber lining as useless as fingernails on an ice wall. On surface, George Dubois heard the snap of the hoist cable, and it was suddenly slapping impotently against the shaft wall, and he ran to the metal gate shouting for his son. And other miners tried to calm him, but George was inconsolable. I should never let him go. I should never have let him on that cage, he cried. Meanwhile, Eddie Taillefer, Larry Bilodeau, and Paul Stringer were still standing at the cage station at the 1575 level when they saw the number 3 cage go hurtling past. There were sparks flying from the sides, and the eerie lights of the trapped men flashed as the cage whizzed by. Normally, the lamps would have been hidden by the cage grate, but the force of the descent had thrown them all to the upper part of the cage. At 66 feet below surface, the cage hit the 90-pound iron rails which made up the sides of the ore spillage pocket. That impact ballooned the bottom of the cage outwards and contracted it to a mere height of 2 feet. There it lay, with 16 men trapped inside, suspended above the icy cold waters of the sump 19 feet below. It took Eddie Taillefer 15 minutes to climb down the slippery ladders of the side shaft to get to the accident. And from somewhere in the cage, he could hear the sounds of moaning, like men speaking in slow motion. As Eddie got close, he could make out 2 voices, and the rest were as silent as the surrounding rock. He called out to them, and his buddy, Ubal Lago, called back. "Taillefer," he cried, "get us out. We're dying in here." And Taillefer tried to comfort his trapped friend. "Please, don't tell my wife what happened," Lugo called out from the darkness. She was at home that morning with her 2 children, 5-year-old Annette and 4-year-old Jacqueline. He would never see his girls again. And Taillefer knew that without acetylene torches, there was nothing that they could do to help. So Taillefer and his 2 partners returned to the surface to wait for the mine rescue squad. The rescue mission, it was a dismal process. Ubod Lago was the only one still alive by the time the cage was open, but he died soon after they got him to surface. Mine rescue spent 8 hours pulling the bodies from the upper cage. Then they hunkered down for the gruesome task of opening the badly crushed lower cage. In the months to come, numerous inquiries, studies, and tests were done to determine how that accident happened and how to ensure that it would never happen again. The cable passed a visual inspection, but there were parts inside that were corroded in a number of key sections. And the emergency dogs had been set improperly. If they had been placed further apart, they would have caught the wood and possibly stopped the descent. None of the investigators blamed the Paymaster management for the corrosion of the cable. The Paymaster disaster was recognized as a horrific tragedy. It was the 2nd worst mining tragedy in the history of the Timmins region. But deaths in the mines were part of the price of doing business. The 16 cage deaths were added to the other Paymaster fatalities that happened over a 12-month period. 2 Finlanders gassed in an underground stope. Andrew Kelford crushed by the door of an ore bin. Trackmen Jean Bernard and Peter Canduso, who were on a runaway ore train that broke through the shaft station and down into the cage, being operated by John Laverick. And those 3 men plunged to a very messy death at the bottom of the same shaft, which had already claimed 16 men that year. The Paymaster mine operated for 50 years. It finally closed in 1966. In the late 1990s, plans were made to reopen the Paymaster mine, but it never happened.
In